And we are live. Welcome back to Faraday Academy, everyone. If you don't know me, my name is Gwen, and I am here today with Jared Wilcurt, who's a senior software engineer and prolific Vue.js developer, open source contributor, among all the other things that he does. I also interviewed him on my podcast, Faraday Tech Cafe, a few months ago, so you might have heard him on there. And today he's going to tell us about all of the updates that are coming in Vue.js version 3, which is currently in beta and expected to come out, the full version in a few months. So during this live stream, if there's anything that you want to say about Vue 3, how awesome it is, or anything that you want to ask Jared while he's here, then feel free to post it in the chat, and we'll try to get to all of those questions. So, Jared, welcome. Do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. Yeah. I'm a senior dev, as mentioned. I've been using Vue for a while, and I run a Vue meetup group. I've been to VueConf a bunch of times. All that stuff. Real into Vue. Big fan of it. I've made a couple libraries around it, that kind of stuff.
So when did you start using Vue?
Probably like three and a half years ago.
Okay. So that was version 2, right? At the time you started?
Yeah, it would have been probably 2.2 or 2.3.
So before before you started with Vue, you were using other JavaScript frameworks, right? I think Backbone, you saw a little bit of React, which we're not going to talk about today.
Yeah, not a fan. I jumped around. I played around with a lot of different stuff. The whole jQuery thing was huge forever, and a lot of stuff with Backbone at work. Played around with Angular 1, Meteor, and React, and Riot, and
I forgot about Riot.
Riot. I played around with it briefly before I found Vue. I found that all the stuff that I really liked about Riot was stuff that was already in Vue and done better in Vue. And so that was really exciting, going from Riot and then like the next day finding Vue and being like, oh, good, it has all the stuff I liked, and a big ecosystem, and really well executed.
So what stuff are you talking about? Like, what was the stuff that made you switch to Vue from what you were doing before?
There was a lot of stuff. I was really frustrated with React and the React ecosystem and the approach that they took on things and how they documented things. And a lot of people don't realize this today, but for like the first 2.5 years, React had barely any documentation. It was awful. It was really hard to find out what you're doing. And the go-to that everyone said was, oh, well, just go watch this Egghead IO video series, and that will teach you. And that was the way. Yeah, everyone said just go watch that. And that series really wasn't that good. It had a lot of expectations and assumptions at what your skill level was.
It was more for intermediate or advanced listeners.
Yeah, and I don't want to have to pay attention. Like, that's rude. So no, when I found Vue, I was really at a frustrated point and was like, if you don't wow me in the first 5 seconds, I'm going to the next thing. Look, I'm over it at this point. And then I found that it was actually super easy to get started with. It was really convenient. And then the more I looked at it, in like just the first hour of looking at it, I didn't ever get turned off of it and be like, oh, but it's got that though. And no, every single step of the way, I'm like, oh, that's really clever. That's a really simple way of doing that. That's really smart. I like that approach. And then I got to the Vue single file components, where it's a .vue file, and it has a section for your markup, a section for your script, and a section for your styling. And I saw how they had set that up, how the 3 sections can all talk to each other, and it was just such a convenient way of organizing your components and separating your your features, but also still being able to um, have a separation of concerns between the different aspects of front end development. Um, and that was really impressive. And then seeing that, like, but that's cool, but I don't want to give up Sass. And it's like, oh, you don't have to. Just do lang equals
Yeah.
Sass. Oh, perfect. Okay. Yeah. All right. I'm in. Like, this is great. And then seeing how they did scoped styling, because this was some of the earlier days of people trying to do new solutions with CSS and trying to put CSS inside of JavaScript and JavaScript inside of CSS and all sorts of weird combinations thereof. And there were a lot of different approaches, and they all had really bad drawbacks. Even
Yeah.
to this day, like none of them are perfect. They all have specific concessions that they make that you have to accept if you're going to go that route. Um, but then the Vue route was like, no, it's everything you want. It's perfect. We have this optional scoped thing that you can do, and the one drawback is it increases the specificity of your selector by 1 point. And
Mm.
like that's a like of all of the bad things that I'd seen with the JavaScript and CSS combinations, that was like the weakest negative that I had found. So like that was something where I was like, that's really clever how they're doing that with a data-v attribute for those things. So a lot of that kind of stuff of just being impressed really by the how well named everything was in the API and how simple and easy it was to get started, and you didn't need to, spend a bunch of time learning the entire framework before you can do anything in it. It was like, no, 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 no. Here's the hello world, and from here, just go and look up whatever you need to know when you need it, and don't worry about it until then. And it
Is
was
it,
a really easy onboarding situation. So just very impressed. And then I played around with it on my free time for probably 3 to 6 months before I quit my job and got a new job doing Vue full time. So didn't take long, really.
to fall in love with it. Yeah, like you mentioned, I think it was a really good idea too for them to make it easy to start. So you can start with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You don't need anything else. But then you also have the flexibility. So with your HTML, you can use JSX or any other kind of templating, or you can use HTML. And with your CSS, you can use Sass or Stylus or any of these different types of things you want directly in your component files. So it was easy to start with, just with the basics, or you could customize it however you wanted out of the box. So yeah, that was really nice. So how has your
Yeah.
experience? You talked about a little bit why you got into it, and then about getting started in Vue. How is your experience now? You've been at the same company working in Vue for several years. Um,
hmm
how have you liked that experience? Pros, cons?
Um, all pros mostly.
Vue's
There's
all
very
good.
few. Yeah, there's very few gripes that I would have, and yeah, there's very few issues I have with it, and they're all like really minor. So yeah, it's been pretty wonderful. Uh, yeah, as mentioned, our the project that we do at work is done entirely in Vue using the Vue CLI and Vuex and Vue
Mm.
Router and the whole ecosystem, and Vue test utils and all that kind of stuff. Um, and the Vue dev tools, like there's so many aspects of the ecosystem that just work so well together that it's really nice. I would say some of the stuff that I wish was better is Vue is gotten to the point where it's very large, and it's been pretty large for a while as an ecosystem. And basically, anything you want, you'll find a couple of options out there for it.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be nicer if we had as big of an ecosystem as what like React has. So with Vue, there's going to be a dozen projects on Vue Awesome for any specific thing I want, and I can go through and look through, and like of those, there'll be three good ones and nine other ones that are kind of meh or just not maintained anymore. In the React world, it's the same thing, except just the ratio is the same, just the total number of stuff is increased. So that would be nice if there was just more options, I guess, overall. But like, I've never had a problem where I didn't find something that I could use, where I was like, none of these are good. I have to make my own. It's always like, uh, these are both really good, and this one has this feature I want, and this one has this other feature I want, but they don't both have those two features, and I have to pick which one's more important. And then like put a little issue and be like, hey, can you steal this from the other project? So that would be one of the things. So like the official Vue repos are all amazing. It's just the occasionally the stuff outside of it. But what's nice is that the people in the Vue world are so dedicated. They're so passionate about everything. So you find someone and they're willing to spend their free time maintaining this, calendar library or whatever. And you pull up a pull request and it'll actually get merged, and you put up an issue and it'll get fixed in a day or two and have a new release out. So that's been nice, and that's been consistent for the like 3 years that I've been doing stuff in Vue. Every time I find a random one-off library that looks like it's still maintained, like they're always happy to fix stuff instantly.
So the popularity of Vue is increasing. I think it's doubling every year or maybe more globally.
Yeah, it doubled in 2017, going from the last numbers I saw were January. So January 2019 to January 2020, the NPM downloads were 1.7 times
Okay.
year over year. So not quite doubled, but like that's still amazing growth for
Yeah.
this far in and with how big it is already. So yeah, the adoption of it just keeps going. It's never slowed down. And it's been the fastest growing JavaScript framework in JavaScript history. Like it's outpacing React. React just had a much bigger foothold to begin with,
Yeah.
but the growth it has is tremendous,
And I think
which shows a really bright future.
yeah, I think Vue's a little different because it became so popular in China first, and then it kind of trickled to the rest of the world. React
Yeah.
React was kind of supported by a big company, so the whole world kind of got it at once, I guess.
hmm Yeah, it had that big marketing push behind it to
Yeah.
start off with. Um, yeah, yeah.
So now getting on to the meat of the topic, Vue 3. So most of your experience for a couple years has been in Vue 2, and now since last year we've been hearing all of these rumors and seeing proposals for all the features of Vue 3. So could you give us a little overview of kind of the core updates that are coming in Vue 3?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much we want to dive in real deep on this, but from just a real high level, if I had to summarize it, I'd say like the core theme of the update for Vue 3 would be backwards compatibility, um, simplicity, and performance has been the real three focuses there. And there's so many features to dive into, and we're not going to talk a whole lot about backwards compatibility, because that's not a new feature, but it is like their core driving focus with this is that they saw when Angular 1 went to Angular 2 and it caused you to rewrite basically every line of code in your entire project.
Yeah.
Like that turned a lot of people against Google, specifically Angular, but like Google in general, like they lost a lot of trust. Like people who were using Polymer were less likely to adopt it now after seeing that. So that was they took a big hit when they did that, and Vue is learning from their mistake. So they want to make sure that when you go from 2 to 3, it's as easy as possible. And what it feels like to write a code base in 2 is going to feel the same when you go to 3. And that's not going to change. And existing code bases are going to be almost identical to the new thing. There'll be some stuff that has breaking changes, but they're going to be small, and where possible, they're going to fix that for you automatically, which is actually kind of cool. As one of the new features, if you created a project using the Vue CLI for Vue 2 and you update that to Vue 3, the Vue CLI will automatically change your components and find those breaking changes and rewrite that code from the way it was done in Vue 2 to the way it is done in Vue 3.
That's awesome.
And it just automatically fixes it. And that's already there. Like I had that, I had a Vue 2 project I tried that out on probably 3 or 4 months ago, and it worked. And that was really impressive that that's already in place. So as they get closer to releasing it, I'm sure they'll be adding more and more of those automatic conversions in there. So the process at work of updating our giant code base we've been working on with a team of people working on it every day for years, that instead of being like a 2-week undertaking, will probably be like 5 minutes. We'll just do it all for us. It'll be great.
That's awesome. So the options API is almost the same. I think it's just a few of the, I guess, component functionality, like when you do Vue.next, I believe instead of being globally available, you have to explicitly import some of Vue's functionalities and the lower level APIs instead of how you access them right now on this $.
Most of that should still be the same and work
Okay.
as before. They did so Vue 3 is a complete rewrite. So the virtual DOM system got a complete rewrite from the ground up. The reactivity engine is a complete rewrite, and the whole code base got converted over from JavaScript and Flow to TypeScript. So every line's been touched in the rewrite. So they in that process they did a lot of tree shaking stuff, so that there's a lot of parts of the Vue internals that are now separate modules. So like even directives like a V model or a V4, those are now their own individual modules under the hood. So if you write an app and you never use V else if or V4, then the code that Vue uses for that doesn't get shipped with your app. So it slims those things down. And same thing with all of those built-in components that like transition or transition group or keep alive. All of those are tree shapeable now, but you don't need to manually import them. Vue will automatically detect that you're using them and under the hood set up that dependency for you while you're doing your development. So it's a really clever system they've done. So your code doesn't really need to change. You don't need to start importing all of these tree shakeable items. It imports them. It dynamically sets up the imports for you. So that's really cool, and that's one of those parts that I would list under like performance gains. From doing all this tree shaking and this rewrite, the new Hello World in Vue is now half the size, half the distribution size as what it was in Vue 2. So that's like a big win there. It's down to about 10 kilobytes now when gzipped, roughly. And so that's huge. Whereas it was around 20, 21, I think, in Vue 2, which, that's twice the size as what Vue 3 is, right? But that was still very small compared to everything else out there. Like,
Yeah.
considerably smaller than React, or like jQuery is huge in comparison. So yeah, Vue already very tiny, and now it's going to be even half the size.
Yeah, I didn't
So
realize they were tree shaking down to the minute directives. That's really awesome.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
so
Same thing with mixins and memoize and async component stuff. All of those are tree shakeable too. So there's a lot of advanced things under the hood that are set up that way.
cool. So the function call, I said heart Jared. So I guess he's a fan of yours. Um,
Oh. Hello.
So Total Gaming Madness asked, "Is it true?" I know your answer already, but maybe you could explain why. He asked, "Is it true that Vue is easier to learn than React?"
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. On like a multiple levels, it is the first off, the documentation is just the gold standard of documentation. Like you won't
Yes.
find anything online better documented than Vue. Not just like it completely covers everything that needs documented, but like how much effort and craft went into um, designing the documentation to be as beginner friendly as possible. It's the first thing I've found that feels like a true replacement for jQuery in the sense that a complete beginner who barely knows any JavaScript at all could start with this library and actually start making stuff and building things. And that's what jQuery was always good at, was just giving you a much simpler API to kind of get you your feet wet and get started, and being very beginner friendly and easy to look stuff up. Vue is the first thing I've seen since jQuery that feels like a true successor for that, like complete beginner. So like they don't make any assumptions. They treat everything as though it should be explained and explained well and simply, while not wasting your time or speaking down to you. It's really just beautiful. The docs are amazing.
Yeah.
Um,
They had a
and
really
with
good
that,
team working on that.
yeah, yeah. Um, Vue is also the only of the big frameworks out there that people talk about of Vue, Angular, React, Svelte. It's the only one that's designed for you to actually write your code in JavaScript. Like React wants you to write it in JSX. Angular wants you to write it in TypeScript, and Svelte has their own little Svelty language that needs to be compiled to something else to work. Where Vue, they very much want this to be able to be linked to on a CDN and just ran on a web page. And because of that, it makes things like playing around in JS Fiddle or CodePen super easy and really intuitive. I would also say the naming convention is really impressive for how well everything is named. That's something that React gets a lot of complaints about. Is never in a million years would you think to say component did might did could mount mounted component almost mounted. Is that was that it? I don't remember. Right? Like it's so badly named. Whereas in Vue, it's mounted.
Yeah.
What about if you wanted to run it before the mount? That's called before mount. Oh, so it's mounted and before mount. Ah, what about when it's created? That's created and before create. Okay, created before create, mounted before mount. Like it's just so intuitive and obvious. Um, and yeah, so those are the kind of things where like it's much easier to learn. There's also it does a lot more for you. Um, whereas React, you really have to do a lot of hand holding, and you kind of have to babysit the state and really keep track of stuff, and you have to learn how to do it the right way, or you'll get these like kind of hard to diagnose errors where it's not obvious that you're doing it wrong. Whereas Vue is just like you can do it however you want, but if you do it the way they want you to, they'll give you candy, right? Like you don't have to do it their way, but if you do, they give you stuff for free. They make things easier. So it's really a much better you know uh, a much better carrot and stick approach with Vue. And it's also progressive. It's a progressive framework, so you only need to learn the tiniest bit, and then when you're ready for routing, you pull in Vue Router. When you're ready for state management, you pull in Vuex.
Yeah.
And it's nice that these are like best in class solutions. Like there's nothing out there better than Vue Router when it comes to routing stuff. And there's nothing out there for the state management options. Like I don't think Vuex is perfect, but it's there. All of the other options out there are terrible. Like they're so bad for state management. And Vuex is like, oh, this is actually like not bad. This is decent. Like I can use this. And I don't hate myself. Like,
Well, Vuex has the advantage because it's made by the core team, so it kind of
yeah,
fits so
and it's
well into Vue already.
exactly. It only works with Vue.
Yeah.
Whereas all of these other options are mainly generic, so that like you can use Redux with Vue. Like no one would because Redux is the U, but uh, you could.
Read.
Whereas Vuex only works with Vue, and because of that, they can make a lot of assumptions to make it a lot simpler for you, so that you have less boilerplating and it does a lot for you. And the next version of Vuex, which we'll talk about later when we get into that stuff,
Yeah.
is going to be like all of my gripes that I have about Vuex, which are like tiny, not a lot, are all going to be fixed in the next version. So I'm super excited about that.
Yeah. I just want to say that React, Angular, even Redux, I think those were important evolutionary steps that Vue learned from to come up with all of the different um, pieces of Vue and also the pieces of the Vue ecosystem and how it set all that up together. So I wouldn't say that Redux is bad, but I'd say that it it was a necessary evolutionary step to get better. I think.
I mean, I find it painful, right? Like I try to use Redux and it was so painful. Um, and Vuex is like has a couple of very slight pain points, but they're pretty mild and you don't run into them very often. And all of those are being fixed in the next version. So we'll talk more about that in a
Wow.
minute. But
So
um,
so of all
yeah.
the new features coming out in Vue 3, do you have one or a couple that you're particularly excited about?
So like the performance stuff is huge. For free, you get all the performance stuff. So like the smaller disk size, it's going to use half as much memory as Vue 2, and it's the speed of it will be somewhere between 2 and 6 times faster, depending on the component
Wow.
and the application, but a minimum of twice as fast. So half the disk size, half the memory usage, twice as fast. Like, and all that's for free. You don't need to change anything. You don't need to, manually tweak and optimize your code to make sure that it works right. No, you just switch a version number and ta-da, it's twice as fast. So that's really cool. Um, the what I mentioned, like one of the core concepts that of Vue 3 is going to be simplicity. They've really gone through and looked at edge cases and areas, more advanced areas that you wouldn't, because Vue 2 is already great. Like if if the whole Vue team gave up and they never did anything else, I'd probably use Vue 2 for the rest of my life until something uh, you know easier and better came out. I wouldn't be I'd be fine with it. Like Vue 2 is great. But if you go use it a lot, you hit these advanced edge cases less than 1% of the time, but those edge cases can have some roughness on them, and they've sanded those down. So they switched the reactivity engine from being done manually to now using proxies, which is a new feature in browsers. Um, and those proxies, whenever you're doing reactivity in Vue and you have a really deeply nested array of objects with sub objects, like that's when having Vue be aware that this deeply nested key changed on this object, and it needs to reactively respond to that. Those it can do that, but the way you have to do that feels like you have to be very verbose with how you define that, and that's not going to be necessary anymore because the browser handles that for Vue. So that simplifies the reactivity engine a lot, and these kind of edge cases where you have to kind of write your code around that limitation of the browser isn't there anymore because the browser doesn't have that limitation. So that's the thing I'm most excited about is from a clean code perspective, there's a lot of um, little functions here and there that I want to clean up where I'm I'm having to be a lot more verbose than I'd like to be.
Mm.
Um, so that's the feature that I'm most excited about. Um, but there's just so many little things that they've done with it. The, like there some of the stuff like just from an optimization standpoint, um, like there's things that Vue is able to do from a optimization standpoint because it's using templates that you can't do in React or Svelte or something. Um, so like Vue and React both use a virtual DOM,
Mm-hmm.
but because Vue uses a template, we're able to do really clever optimizations with it. So they've added in what's called static tree hoisting under the hood in the template compilation process when you're going from a template and it's compiling it into a render function. It'll actually look at your DOM tree and see where are the parts that are dynamic, where you have those double curly braces and a value that's dynamic, or you have like an attribute, like a vbind attribute with a little colon title or something. It looks for those and it knows, okay, these could potentially change. But everything else that isn't reactive, those are never going to change. Whenever we do a diff, we don't need to loop over and diff our virtual DOM against those static parts. So it just very cleverly pulls that out so that it's hoisted up a level above the function as a const, and just simply using a const and creating that as a static DOM tree node. Just doing that, the browser JavaScript engine in the browser will see the const and under the hood, low level, will keep that in memory. So it's not doing garbage collection, so it's faster there. It's less memory usage. And it will also skip that in the loop every time because the browser knows that const means it's not going to change, so it doesn't even bother. So you get that for free, basically. It's just such a clever solution. Yeah, that's a pretty cool optimization that they did there. Yeah,
Does that
and
have
then
to do with, because I know the diffing, so now instead of diffing the whole template to see if something has changed, as your state changes, it re-renders with the virtual DOM and everything. Now it just diffs like the exact tiny piece of the template that changes. Does that have to do with what you were talking about?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So they already had it somewhat optimized previously, where like it would only diff the component that changed and not rediff the whole DOM for the whole app. So that was already saving a ton of time. But now specifically, it will skip entire huge trees of DOM nodes now, because most of your DOM is going to be static content. It's not, you're not every single attribute and every single text node and every single element isn't going to be reactive in most
Yeah.
applications. So huge, huge trees of DOM structure will just going to be completely trimmed away automatically before the page even loads because it'll be compiled into those render function in advance. And so then by the time your app starts up, the only parts it'll ever diff are those dynamic parts. So it'll be a really tiny fast diff. And that's where they get that, half the memory usage and being able to mount the virtual DOM and do patches on it are now twice as fast because of this. And when we say twice as fast, that's like very dependent on what the DOM structure is. So that's where it's like 2 to 6 times as fast. So huge improvements around that.
Oh, someone asked, I missed this. Someone asked any idea about the Vue 3 release date.
I mean, everybody wants it done yesterday. So,
Yeah.
so right now, Vue 3 is out of alpha. It's in beta 15, I believe. And it's in a pretty much done state. There's still a few things here and there that they're cleaning up. They're having people actually try it out and report bugs on it, and they're fixing those
Okay.
and getting it ready. But mainly, what we're waiting on is the rest of the Vue ecosystem to catch up. So, Vue Router, Vuex, the Vue CLI, Vue DevTools, Vue Test Utils, the ESLint plugin for Vue, all of these different things. and most of those are in alpha right now. So
Okay.
I think Vuex is the only one that's made it to beta. And the goal with all of these is don't change anything. Just make it compatible. So if you already have code written in for Vue Router, when you update to Vue 3 and you update Vue Router to the latest version that's compatible with Vue 3, you don't have to rewrite your Vue Router code. It should work the same. And the same thing with Vuex. Um, and then once all the Vue 3 stuff is done, then those other libraries can start innovating and trying new things, and then they can come up with new ideas and breaking changes.
Okay.
Um, yeah, and then I'm assuming the Vue dev tools would probably be the last thing to update because it would need Vue, Vuex, and Vue Router to all be at a stable, compatible version before it could update to hook into all three of those.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah, so that's where it's at right now. Is Vue 3 is available as a beta, and you can use it for stuff. I've been playing around with it in JS Fiddle, um, and been really just impressed by how child components have been simplified with the being able to pass down attributes and listeners into them is much more. It's more powerful now and simpler. I think that's the thing I really like most about this approach for Vue 3 is the total. If you learned everything there is to know about Vue 3, the amount of information you know will be less than if you learned everything there is to know about Vue 2. They've simplified it. They've removed concepts. The cognitive load has gotten lighter. It's easier to learn the whole thing. It's faster to learn the whole thing.
Even with the composition API?
Yeah, yeah. That's
Wow.
really the only big new thing. And really, you can learn most of that in a couple of minutes. It's not that crazy once you already know the rest of Vue.
Okay.
Yeah, and I've been playing around with that as well. So we should probably talk about that. That is the new hotness that people are most excited about. So now you've always had multiple ways of writing Vue components, but there was basically one happy path, one official approach of use this object syntax and use single file components with a template and script and style section. And that's like the general, this is probably the way you should do it. Feel free to deviate if you have a good reason to, but the closer you stick to this, the easier things will be for you, and the nicer things will be. So there is now a second alternative way for a happy path approach, and that is rather than have your code be organized, have an inherent organizational structure where all of your methods go in this one area. All of your reactive state for the component goes in the data section. These computed things go in their own section. Your lifecycle hooks go in their own section. Rather than have that approach, instead you have one big function, which is your setup spot, and then inside of that, you can pull in any of those concepts and arrange them however you want. And the alternative approach to organizing your code that people like about this is that you could, instead of grouping by like functionality, where these are all methods, so they all go together. This is all state, so they go in the data section. These are all computed, they go together. Instead of grouping it that way, you could group them by saying, well, this piece of item in the data section and these two methods and this computed are all related to the same div on the page. So we're going to group all of those together in one area and make that its own function. And then these other pieces of state and this other methods and these other things are all related to this other div on the page. So we're going to group those together. So you can kind of group stuff in a feature-based way in your script section of logic, which I think works in certain cases. In general, I think a framework that has inherent organizational structure built in is just so powerful. It gives you so much out of the box where you have that convention where I can hop into any Vue code base and I know where everything's at instantly. I don't have to figure out what they invented to organize their code. So that's really a convenient thing of the object syntax. Um,
So you think in most cases people will still be using the same regular object options API?
if they were already using it, I imagine that they're probably not going to be interested in this new thing. But with that said, there are groups of people that will find this really appealing, mainly TypeScript users. So, from what I've talked to, people who are TypeScript people on Vue who are using a class based approach rather than the object syntax that use a Vue class component plugin, which will still be supported in Vue 3, that class style approach. But when they see the new, more functional approach that the composition API gives you, they're way more excited about that. So everybody I've seen that's been using the class-based approach instead of object syntax are very excited to drop that and switch over to the composition API.
Yeah, there were a lot of edge cases.
Yeah, it was a little clunky. It's supposed to be a lot smoother. The class component will be a lot smoother in Vue 3, but I'm not sure how many people are even going to bother with that because that was really just trying to get better TypeScript support, and you get full TypeScript support with the composition API. So if you need TypeScript support, you need that full-on stuff, then the composition API is there for you. If you don't need the TypeScript support, then the object syntax is a much better API overall for just a general component. Where the composition API really shines, though, is as a replacement for mixins.
Yeah.
So mixins are an external file that is structured in the same way that you would structure the object syntax. And whatever you have there, you can import that into multiple components, and it will get mixed in with those components. And that's really good for code reuse when you have two components where the logic is basically the same, but the template is different. Then you could have the majority of your logic shared from one file. So anytime you fix a bug or add a feature, you do it in one place, and everything it's relying on gets updated. It's also nice for genericization when you have a generic listing page in a CRUD app, and you have a bunch of listing pages, then having a mixin that gets pulled into each of those listing pages simplifies them so that they all have basically the same core code that they refer to. And then if they have any weird, unique stuff that's specific to that listing page, they can still have that in their own component. But that's where mixins are really useful. But the downside is that it's not obvious where that code is coming from.
Yeah, with mixins, right?
Yeah, with the mixin, it's tough to know what's happening because you could define a value in the data section, and then in that mixin file, and then in your components, you could have a method that references it and says this.kitten, and you look at it, and there's no kitten anywhere in that file, and you're like, where is this coming from? And then you're like, oh, there's a section for mixins, and we're importing in 6 mixins. Which one has the kitten? Right, and it may not be very obvious if it's something, more general sounding.
Yeah, that's one reason why I didn't use mixins, was because you were putting all these, littering up the component state, but you had no idea where everything came from. So if you have other people working on the application, it can get really confusing. So I think
yeah, it does. It definitely does. We use them at work because that was the simplest option for code reuse, but no one likes them. We appreciate what they let us do, and we understand how they work, and they're actually kind of clever how they work. But that development experience is really clunky. Like, it almost seems like I would need my editor to show, merge in and show a ghost version of the functions that are being pulled in from this other file, and inject those in and gray them out or something to show hey, by the way, this is from this mixin file. That would make it a lot easier, but you'd have to write some crazy IDE plugin for that to be the case. And a much simpler solution is to use the new composition API. And that's available in Vue 2 as a plugin. So you can already get that.
Okay.
So if you're on Vue 2 and you have that use case where you need code reusability between multiple components, you can pull in the composition API as a plugin. You can write all your code in it. And then when you switch to Vue 3, you just get rid of the plugin, but you keep the composition API because that'll still match and be compatible with Vue 3's composition API. Um, and there's a few other features like that. Like there's multiple root components are a thing. So you can actually now have uh, multiple divs at the top level of your component, and it's not going to complain and say you need one wrapper around all of your stuff. You can only have one root level element. That's going to go away. Um, you still need a root level thing, a wrapper, but you wrap it in a built-in component called Fragment.
Yeah.
So that Fragment wrapper then wraps the rest of the stuff, and that doesn't show up in the DOM in the end, which is really nice. And there's also a Vue 2 plugin for the Fragment.
Basically the same thing that React did recently. Make it so you didn't have to wrap everything in just one DOM element. You could render multiple DOM elements from one template, basically.
Yeah, yeah. And like that's one of those things that shouldn't be that hard, right? But like it took both of these huge projects with so many people with their eyes on them and working on this stuff, took them both over 5 years to find a way to make that work. So like it's a lot harder than it sounds. It's one of those things where your boss says, "Hey, can you make this? Can you do this thing? Get this up?" And by the end of the day, and you're like, "I can get that done by next month." Like, I don't think you understand how hard that is. It's one of those kind of things where it's suspiciously harder than expected.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's really cool. The fragment thing's there and also available in Vue 2, and that'll be when you go to Vue 3, you just remove the plugin, and your code stays the same.
Harold.
So that's a feature.
Harold said Vue feels to me like writing HTML with superpowers. No question, he just made a statement.
No, yeah, yeah, that's what I really like. That was one of those things where like every system of substantial size has gotchas in it, and Vue's no exclusion to that. But you have to be working on it for a long time, very deeply before you run into those gotchas. You have to be doing some weird stuff and like really doing some crazy things. Whereas like with React, they have a page called gotchas on their documentation, and like it's expected that they need to teach you about these gotchas on day one, because you're gonna type div class equals active and it's gonna explode because you can't use class in your HTML. And it's like the most commonly used attribute in all of HTML, and you can't use it in React. You have to use class name. And it just seems like that's bad and arbitrary, and you should be able to suss that out some other way. You invented your own meta language. Surely you can find a way around this. And that's not the problem. Like, you don't have those problems in Vue. Like, it's just class. It's that. It's just HTML, except you can put a colon in front of the attribute, and now it has superpowers.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's part of why it's so beginner friendly. There's such a smaller foothold of information you need to know to start doing basic stuff.
Yeah. So you said there's a couple, I guess, gotchas and things in Vue. Do you think anything's missing from Vue 3 that you think should have been there, or maybe one of the proposals that was being made to include in Vue 3 isn't included that you think should be there? Did that make sense?
Yeah, no, yeah,
Okay.
that makes sense. But not really. Like, as mentioned, like Vue 2, from a normal user standpoint, was basically good. Like, you were fine. Um, from a library author standpoint, there were some advanced edge cases where you could still make it do what you wanted, but it wasn't as polished as the rest of Vue. It wasn't to the same level of ease of use. And that's what a lot of Vue 3 has changed, of like the internal engine's APIs are now being exposed as a first-party API that are maintained and versioned. So like um, native script Vue is a means to create native iOS and Android apps written in a Vue style. So you write your Vue components and they work both on web and on mobile as a native app.
Mm-hmm.
And the way they did that was they forked off of Vue and they manually tweaked some of the insides of it. So anytime Vue updated, they had to pull downstream and reapply those tweaks. Um, and so now in Vue 3, they just expose a simple API. So they don't need to be downstream and have that extra burden. They can just pull it in as a dependency and have their own code hook into the APIs that are officially maintained. And a lot of stuff like stuff for server-side rendering, stuff for like you, the Vue, the core of Vue doesn't care what the UI is. It doesn't care if it's a DOM. It doesn't care if it's being rendered on an Android phone. It doesn't care if it's rendering a UI inside of a terminal interface or inside of WebGL. And there's already a Vue 3 WebGL prototype that someone made that uses Vue 3 to update WebGL visuals in the browser.
Sweet, that's awesome.
Yeah, so like that, it's been broken down to these much smaller modules and exposed better for those advanced things.
So you're saying
The
the rendering engine, right?
Yeah, yeah, and the render functions themselves have been simplified a lot. So now there's only a flat object of values in a render function, which is nice because previously the render functions were kind of clunky and hard to use. So nobody used them unless they had to, and the only people who would be UI component libraries like Vuetify or Inkscape or those kind of guys. So they would have good reason to. They would have reasons to use the render functions for advanced purposes of, having a slot that you can pass arbitrary markup into, but then having the render function loop over the elements being passed into the slot and modify and mutate them and wrap them in other elements and so on, and be able to do that on the fly. And that's something that the template syntax wouldn't allow for, that level of advanced detail. And you're never going to need that unless you're building a component library like that. So a lot of those kind of things have been simplified and made easier. Whereas, previously the render functions were so complex, it wasn't uncommon for someone to pull in JSX. So you could still do a render function via JSX to produce a Vue render function in a simpler, easier to read manner. And I'm so happy to know that JSX is no longer something that people are going to be using with Vue out of necessity. That's something that you've always been able to if you wanted to, but like there's better options, and there always have been, except for that one edge case. So I'm really happy that that's been improved on, and I've been watching some stuff on Vue Mastery about that lately, and Evan Yu is doing a deep dive. That's actually free this weekend for anyone who wants to see the Evan Yu deep dive on render functions and some of the insides of Vue 3, the internals.
When does this weekend start? Is that tomorrow or Saturday?
I think it's 26th and 27th, I want to say.
Okay, so this Saturday and Sunday it'll be
Yeah,
free.
on Vue Mastery. So that'll be free this weekend.
Cool.
But yeah, it's very like nitty gritty. It's really more for like people who make libraries.
Yeah, I noticed when I was digging through the Vuetify source code for that video I did on Vuetify, and the course that I did, they used a lot of complex rendering and stuff, so maybe they're going to simplify it with the new rendering system.
Yeah, they'll definitely have to rewrite a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
But it should be simpler though when they do rewrite it.
Yeah, I'm sure they've already started. So with all the rewrites, I know Vue 3 was completely rewritten, and now all of the frameworks or all of the libraries related to Vue.js are being rewritten and updated to match Vue 3.
Mhm.
So, are there any, I guess, notable updates or really big changes coming out with these other libraries in the Vue ecosystem?
Um,
Like Vue
so
Router, Vuex, those libraries?
yeah, View Router is not going to change anything, and View like again, all of these are trying to just maintain existence, compatibility with Vue 2 whenever you update to it. Vue test utils will probably be the biggest difference. So that's something that
Hmm.
I've been using in beta since 2017, and it just came out of beta like a month ago. Like in this past month, it finally came to version 1, and that's with a lot of effort from some new people on the Vue core team that were working on specifically just the Vue test utils library, trying to get that wrapped up into version 1, and then now they're working on version 2, which will be Vue 3 compatible, and then they'll be working on migration between version 1 to version 2. So that's the stuff that will probably see the biggest
Okay.
changes because they're making a lot of different changes for Vue 3 compatibility for it, and they're taking the approach of trying to reduce the overall surface area of the utilities library to be as small as possible and to touch as few things as possible while still letting you be able to do all the testing that you need to do in Vue. So that'll be a big one. After the Vue 3 stuff, that's when we'll see these other libraries start doing more interesting things again.
Okay.
The Vuex is the one that I'm most excited about, as we teased earlier. Um, Vuex has in it the concept of an action and a mutation. The mutation is a function that can mutate the state globally, and it has to be synchronous. That's its limitation. It can't call other mutations. It's synchronous and mutates state, and that's all it does. Actions can be asynchronous, and they can call multiple mutations, but they themselves cannot directly mutate the state. So the next big change for Vuex, which will probably be a major breaking change long after Vue 3 comes out, they'll start working on this, and then this will come to fruition. They're going to combine those two essentially. So mutations will now be able to be asynchronous, and they'll be able to call other mutations while still being able to mutate the state. And this basically means there's no need for actions anymore. So the actions will go away, and then that's one less concept to have to learn about. And that really is the main every little pain point that I've ran into with Vuex will be solved by that. Of where it's like this feels like I have to do more boilerplate than I should, right? Which is my huge complaint with the like reducers and Redux of
Yeah.
like so much boilerplating there um, for no real value. Whereas now the combining of these two things seems like this is the best way you can do the flux pattern.
Yeah.
So I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, that'll definitely simplify it. And actually, there was, I can't remember now because it's been so long since I used Redux, but there was this library out there that was made to simplify Redux, and basically it did just that. It combined actions and reducers into one step. So views kind of, and it was so much simpler than using Redux because they got rid of some of the other boilerplate. I can't remember exactly, but it looks like Vue's doing the same thing, which I think is a great idea. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see from like a cultural phenomenon how people end up naming their mutations now, because it was it was quasi common in Vuex for people to have mutations that were all capital letters with underscores, but then have their actions just be a normal JavaScript camel case style method name for their actions. So now that it's really interesting to see who feels like, well, I have actions that can now have the superpower of also being able to mutate things, or if they're going to see it as my mutations now have the superpower of being asynchronous and calling other mutations, and seeing like um, what people's viewpoint is on that, how they culturally view it, and which naming convention they go with for those. Because I always thought that the all capital letters mutation thing looked weird.
That
Um,
came from React, I believe, because I used to do that when I was in React, because that's pretty much how everyone did it. And then when I moved to Vue, I stopped and started just giving
yeah,
regular names to mutations, because they're just functions.
yeah. I don't do that either. It's just regular camel case for everything. Um, but you do still see in documentation people showing in all caps. So I'm curious what will happen there if people will finally drop that approach or if they'll keep it.
So, what about your own libraries and tools? I know you have a lot of projects that you've made yourself built on Vue and that are open source for the community, like that updated superpower just serializer. I can't
Yeah,
even remember
the
the name anymore.
snapshot serializer.
Yeah.
Uh,
What
yeah,
considerations are you going to have to make to update your libraries and tools to use Vue 3 pretty soon?
yeah. So that one in particular is really niche. So it's tightly coupled with Vue 2 and Jest and the Vue test utils. So it's very tightly coupled. So if any of those change dramatically, that's not going to work, right? It's going to need a lot of also dramatic changes. And we know that Vue is the internals of Vue are changing dramatically, and we're expecting Vue test utils to have a lot of changes. So going to version 2. So I'm expecting that that's probably going to be a total rewrite where I start over and just do the most basic thing and get it hooked up and working, and
Okay.
then slowly go back in and re-add those other features. And the approaches to getting those features to work again may be very different because I had to go through several different phases of, okay, this is a very naive approach to doing this, and this is a little bit more advanced approach, and this is uh, more still advanced but using a different library and a different API so that I have a more efficient approach. So it went through many phases, and I'm expecting it to have to go through that process again. There are two experimental features that, depending on how the new Vue vnode stuff is set up in Vue 3, may be able to be turned into an actual real feature and be brought out of that experimental phase, or just may not be feasible at all. So that'll be an interesting one. The other, I've done a bunch of libraries around Vue, but the other main one, the big one that I've done that people actually use, is a boilerplate for desktop apps for Vue. And that is using the Vue CLI, and that has um, the Vue dev tools built in. So you have basically the same experience you would in a normal web application with Vue. So all of the normal Vue CLI stuff you have access to be able to pull in Vue Router and Vuex and all those kind of plugins and stuff, all of that's available. And SaaS and linting and all of those things are all in place. But then it also has all of the configuration already set up, so it can do builds for distribution on each operating
Yeah.
system desktops. So that's really, I think that's going to be real easy to update to Vue 3 because once all the Vue 3 stuff, all the dust settles, and all of those libraries are up to flush with it, and they're all compatible, and they officially release Vue 3, then that's just starting a new branch, going to the Vue CLI, updating all the dependencies to Vue 3 compatibility, and then making sure that it's still connected properly with the desktop aspect of it. So that one will be pretty easy to update. I don't think that's going to take more than probably 2 days of effort at most to get that all set up and test everything. And have all of the niceties. Maybe the Vue DevTools stuff will take longer, um, if that's not directly compatible yet with it, but should be. All that should be pretty well handled. I'm not too worried about that stuff on that one. So it's going to vary a lot depending on the libraries that are out there and how deeply hooked into the internals of Vue they are.
Yeah. And I guess we'll find out as all the libraries come into beta and start to, you know, be more, I guess, finalized.
Yeah. And for anyone out there who's every once in a while, every couple of weeks, every month or two, they get curious and they're like, oh, what's the status of Vue 3? If you just Google Vue Next, VUE dash next, um, that's the repo for Vue 3. In the README, it has a little table that shows you all the other libraries and what their status is, if they're in alpha or beta or work in progress. So anytime someone asks me that, because I get asked that a lot of when's it coming out, I just
Yeah.
type in Vue Next and I scroll into the table. I'm like, this is what it's waiting on. These are the things that are in progress.
Yeah. Harold said it's hard to make things simpler. It requires deep knowledge. Yeah, it's complicated for the designers of the library to make things simpler, I think.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's the same with anything, right? If you're building an application for somebody, if you want your application to be as easy to use as possible, then that means you need to automate as much of that process as possible on behalf of the user.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of thinking through of what they're actually going to do, and then how can I do as much of that for them, so they don't have to, so that it's already done automatically and they can just confirm that it's correct. So I think that's the same idea there of to make something simple for someone else, you need to take that burden of complexity onto yourself. The complexity has to exist somewhere.
Yeah.
You just need to choose, do you give that to your users or do you take that burden on yourself?
So with all your deep Vue knowledge and your knowledge about Vue 3, are you planning on making any new tutorials or content, libraries, anything else when Vue 3 comes out?
Yeah, I actually just played around with some stuff in JS Fiddle the other day with child components, and I mentioned this a little bit ago of how the interaction between parent and child components and passing down attributes to the children, how that's gotten more robust and more powerful and just simpler. And it's really impressive. And there's some interesting aspects of it that I think would make for like a good video. So when I have time, I think I need to pack after this because I'm leaving for Virginia tomorrow in the middle of the day, and I'll be gone for like a week. And yeah, whenever I
Vacation.
have quasi vacation, yeah, I'll be working like half days.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, I'll be on vacation. I'll be seeing people and doing stuff. But
That's good.
um, yeah, when I have time, I do intend on doing that tutorial, or that write up. I have been doing some write ups on dev.to.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
so I've been doing some stuff on there. I did one recently on showing different basic approaches to styling in Vue or reactive styling. And I'll probably do a more advanced approach to reactive styling using uh, the custom properties in CSS, um, often uh, often inaccurately referred to as CSS variables, but they're way more powerful than just being a variable. The custom properties. There's lots of cool stuff you can do with those.
So,
So
what's your username on dev.to?
the Jared Wilcurt.
Okay, same as
Yep.
everywhere.
Yep. Same as everywhere. So twitter.com/the Jared Wilcurt, dev.to, Medium, GitHub, thejaredwilcurt.com, all those places.
Okay. Yeah, I'll add the dev.to link after. I think I have the rest of your links in the description. So your Twitter, your portfolio website, and oh yeah, your GitHub too.
Yep.
So is there anything else before we wrap up here? Is there anything else you think we missed or that you're dying to say about Vue or Vue 3 or anything else?
Oh man, I don't know. I'm kind of all talked out at this point. I
Okay.
need some more water.
It has been over an hour. My throat's getting dry too.
Yeah.
All right. So, yeah, thanks so much for talking about Vue 3. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. So, yeah, we look forward to your content and we'll definitely share it when you come out with your tutorials and stuff on Vue 3. Like I said, Jared's information is linked in the description below, so you can check him out, follow him, reach out to him if you have some questions. Other than that, have a great night, everyone. Thanks for tuning in, and I will be live on Free Code Camp's YouTube channel at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time tomorrow morning. Have a good night.
Bye.